Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hey there, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along on the journey of this show that we designed to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show with Craig Brown, an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. Hey, Craig, how are you today?
I'm great. The sun is finally out. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. It's about one of those other topics around product lifecycle management, this time around knowledge management. We'll explain more in a moment.
Good. Well, I'm excited about it too, because Craig, every single week, you and I, we try to bring to this podcast interesting interviews and other ideas that are going to help all the listeners enhance and grow their careers. And today is going to be one of those days. Today we have Erich Meier. He is the CTO at Method Park, and his reputation is that he has the ability to really listen to the customer, to hear what they have to say, and he actually seeks to understand what the customer wants. Now, that is an awesome reputation to have in any industry. So, Erich, welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast.
Thank you so much. That's a great introduction and a great compliment to start with. So looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we're glad to have you here. And I think Craig has a whole list of questions for you. So Craig, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, Erich, tell us how you got to your job. And actually, you and I have known each other for about a decade. Why don't you end with how we first met? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So how Craig and I met was during a volcano breakout. I had an introduction or an invitation to a meeting with General Motors, and my partner or my friend at General Motors was about to drive me to the airport when the news broke that this volcano over Iceland broke out, and we will not be able to fly for the foreseeable future. And so my friend said, well, if you're stuck here anyway, I want you to meet my friend Craig. Well, and that's how we met. That was about 10 years ago, even a little longer, and the rest is history, I guess.
So I only bring that up to remind people that in a time like COVID-19, you will have opportunities to interact with people you might not have expected. Make the most of them. They might turn into some great partnership down the road. But Erich, give us a little bit of your background. You're not the typical PLM professional. You guys have come at this a different way. So explain that and explain, in a few seconds, what's Method Park about?
So I'm definitely not a PLM guy per birth. I have a software education. I have a PhD in software engineering. I worked on various types of software since I had my first computer. So I'm really somebody that lives and breathes software. And my job then brought me into product lifecycle management, into products in general. And of course, as a software guy, I always look for speeding things up, making things more flexible. With software, almost everything is possible in a short time. So that's what I grew up with, and that's what I'm still trying to convey in my day-to-day job. So I still try to keep that software mindset that everything's in flux and everything can be changed and a lot of things can be achieved and you can't even think of. And I think that agility, that definitely connected me with the whole agile development movement. And I'm trying to bring that aspect also in product development now.
So at Method Park, you guys focus on process modeling. And in the PLM space, the PLM thought leaders would say, well, we've got workflow and we've got program management tools. Isn't process modeling just something you do for the for the factory, the plant, the flow of material in a plant. Can you describe process modeling and how it's different than workflow that's in the typical PLM tools?
And that's a real great question, because that is almost like a misconception that comes up a lot. When I get in touch with PLM people, they say, "Oh, we do have process management because we have workflow," but workflow and process is really different. At least how we understand it. Just an example. If you could give me a workflow, or if I would ask you for a workflow to build the next generation vehicle, you probably wouldn't be able to give me a workflow. But you probably might be able to give me a process and define a process for that. So workflow is something, in my mind at least, something very rigid, something where it's very predefined, something's very clear. This has to happen before that has to happen. Then the next step can happen. If everybody did this, then the next step can happen. And I'm not debating that it's not useful. It's very useful, but it's not a process. A process, in my mind, is what people do and also how they interact to achieve a specific goal. If it's the end of the day, it's the development of a new vehicle, or if it's the development of a new software release, it's something that can't be completely pre-described. Sometimes you have to work in sequence. Sometimes you can work in parallel. Sometimes you work in iterations. You don't know how many. So it really depends on the goal that you're supposed to achieve. So this process tries to, in my mind, process is an abstraction above, and it tries to describe what people do and how they interact.
Well, and I think that's really important. We talk about in our introduction how it's about the tools and practices we apply to do product lifecycle management. And this whole notion of practice is maybe a similar concept to the way you describe process. You know, if you're a really mature organization, think like a partnership of lawyers or doctors. They never talk about workflow. They talk about their practice and the application of their practice to their business. And I think you're right. It's a higher level abstraction that, at least for complicated products, you need. The other thing you got to remember is lots of stuff's working in parallel, and how you synchronize across those parts of your company that work in parallel. Workflow really stumbles on that. It doesn't know how to have multiple parallel workflows that synchronize at different times work smoothly together. I mean, there are mechanisms to make it work, but it's, workflow, people tend to think about the thing in front of them and the next thing. They don't tend to think about the larger thing that has to come together. So some other companies have talked about knowledge management, and it's an asset to know your practice and your process. It's also an asset to know your findings, maybe even a competitive advantage. And so I've grouped those all into knowledge management. Is this also the way your tools work? Is it a form of knowledge? It's just the knowledge about how to make a great product?
Yes, Craig. So process is certainly a specific type of knowledge. And some of you might know this distinction between explicit and tacit knowledge. And process is certainly something that can be codified or should be able to be codified. So it's definitely on the explicit side of things. And what we use to capture process is we call it a meta model, but we could also call it a taxonomy. It's basically the answering the questions: who should do what, when, how, and why. So these couple of questions and how they relate to each other, they help us to structure the process. So what needs to be done is typically the activities, the deliverables. When it needs to be done, the milestones, the phases, who should do it, a couple of roles, a couple of systems, and so on and so forth. So we use a pretty strict or pretty formal meta model to describe that, whereas and we try to limit it to that. When it comes to normal or global knowledge management, then we dive deeply into this: how we do things, why we do things. And that's where it becomes a little more mushy, a little more harder to codify. And that's why I'd say process management is definitely a subset of knowledge management, and it tries to codify knowledge.
Interesting. So this leads me to the thought about, do you have to sell people on process modeling? Or, when you and I first met, the reason our friend Bill brought you to my attention was we were struggling with a custom tool that did process management. We weren't debating the need for it. We just needed a better answer than the one we had, right? Are other companies like that? Do they know they need process modeling, or are we also able, do you have people knock on your door and say, well, what is this thing and why should I pay attention? Is there one more than the other, or is it a bit of both?
It's a little bit of both, but it's certainly more on this side that how you and I met. So most people have that same problem, but they don't know that a solution like ours exists. Most companies are still stuck in their, if you look at how most companies, or at least the older ones, describe their process, it's a bunch of documents. So they put you in front of a couple of hundred documents, and this is our process. And if they're a little more sophisticated, that's all online, and maybe it's already a little structured, but it's mostly a bunch of documents.
Well, and if it's a bunch of documents, it can't be agile.
It's definitely not agile.
Yeah, the thing you said at the beginning, right? How could it be flexible, right?
You can't change it. It's absolutely impossible. And the poor engineers that have to execute it, they can't read all that stuff. And that's why a lot of companies struggle at that point, but they are not aware of a solution like ours. But once we've got visibility to them and got contact, then it happens the same way as it happened between us. Then there's no question that they need something like that. So we're getting more and more visibility, but we never debate on why we have to do it. So it's not a tough sell. It's more a visibility problem than that.
Interesting. Well, maybe we can help. It's one of the reasons I invited you here was I think the Digital Enterprise Society, we are trying to be broader than any one particular solution provider or tool set, but also these other topics, these topics like knowledge management. They happen at really successful companies, and yet they seem to be a bit of an afterthought in some of the mainstream PLM vendors. And I think PLM, the broadest definition of PLM, it's product lifecycle management. Well, of course you need process management, and you need to include the mechanical guys and the embedded software guys and the electronic guys. You can't leave any of them out. And that's another thing that I've noticed is a lot of what you were describing applies to many roles and way beyond engineering. It could apply to finance, it could apply to sales, it could apply to program management, the people trying to find money and invest in a product. It's interesting to me that you need a process for all of those people, and they, especially in a large company, they're going to interact. They have to interact. And so having a way to orchestrate that, it would be really good. Now, another thing we used to get, we get it less now, but I have run into pockets of engineers. They tend to be at really mature companies, meaning successful, not just old, okay? And they think process rigor slows down innovation. What's your response to that? Is it really true, or does it actually speed it up?
And that's a question that I get a lot as well. My answer to that is it depends on the type of innovation you're talking about. If we're talking about disruptive innovation, so completely inventing new things, I think it's almost impossible to describe a process for that. And if you would try to describe a process for that, then you would certainly slow it down, or potentially slow it down. But that's an area that's very hard to codify anyway. But the more interesting part is the incremental innovation, and that's definitely a part where I would say process is not only speeding things up, it's also necessary. Because in incremental innovation, you need to have a clear vision and need to have a clear path to implementing that vision. And you need to be able to repeat it multiple times. And if you don't have a process for that, then in a lot of cases, you're turning an incremental innovation and almost into disruptive innovation, because you tend to forget things and you tend to be surprised by things, or stabbed in the back by a thing that you haven't thought about. And that definitely slows you down and requires rework. So that's why I would say for incremental innovation, it's definitely a requirement. And there's another aspect to that I would like to mention. It's the process innovation. The process itself is a huge factor in innovation these days. If you think about agile, if you think about model-based systems engineering, if we think about product line engineering, all of those techniques, they're all process innovations. They don't help you to invent more innovative products, but they help you to manage the huge complexity, this exploding complexity of nowadays products. And they're all process innovations. And of course, without process management, you have no chance to implement them.
That's a really good point. That's a good point. And that's part of our trouble, is we think about innovations as the next patent, and actually processes can be patent too, but the next patent for the widget that you put on your product, right? We don't tend to think about, organizational improvement, and even, have a plan as you start out to measure that improvement and know that you're making progress. I ran into one group toward the end of my career at GM that actually did use process management for innovation, and it had to be an area that we had recently decided to insource. So we had a lot of talented engineers, but the thing we were deciding to make ourselves was new to the company culture. And just to fit it in with everything else that was going on at the company, the normal program management practices and the way we fit it into a vehicle and all this other stuff, it was really good to have the process. And then the guys that were leading that segment of the business, they decided how deep to go based upon how much risk there was, right? If it was a really risky subsystem, there was a bit more detail. If it was one where we know how to execute, like a bracket on a wiring harness, we know how to do that. Oh, it was pretty high level. It just said, make sure you get a bracket for the wiring harness, right? So it's interesting. Process rigor and innovation can complement. And I like the points you brought out about the when. If it's truly a brand new innovation, well, maybe not the first time, maybe the next 10 times, though, you might want to have process management. Are there unique companies or industries using these techniques? Can you characterize for us, or is it always the same kind of company, or is there a lot of variation in the company characteristics?
There are some characteristics that are key to that that we identified, and it's mostly that complexity of products. So if a company provides products that are not very complex, which means there have not many components and dependencies, and not a multi-layer architecture, or not a system of systems, then you can work your way through that development typically without having too much process rigor. It's possible, let's say, without having to model your process. But when you have products like vehicles, controls units, aircrafts, medical devices, those are hugely complex systems that are interconnected, that are now, this whole area of Internet of Things. And definitely, if companies are producing and developing those kinds of products, then it's almost a need to have a model process, a defined process that it's provable. Because another aspect of it is all of those industries that I just mentioned, they are regulated. They're subject to safety regulations, reliability, security regulations. And again, most of those have a huge impact on process, how you do things, not just that the product has certain characteristics, but that it was also designed and developed in a specific way. And to prove that is only possible with a defined process. So I would say complex products and regulated environments, those are definitely the two characteristics where I say process modeling is a must. And others, it might be not as rigorous, but for those, it's almost impossible to go without.
Well, I liked your idea about Internet of Things. We've had a few guests that talk about we can measure things now in the factory and in the field that we didn't used to measure, largely because it was too expensive, right? Well, now it's inexpensive to have these measurements, so we can put the measurements on the internet can bring them back to the home office, and now we can look at what it's telling us. What would, it's like all this contract tracing people are talking about right now with watching the pandemic, right, or where it spreads. Well, to be able to fit that into your business, it'd be nice to know where you want those measurements to appear in your process, or even challenge your overall product process and operational or DevOps. How would you benefit from the Internet of Things? Well, having a process model to specify where it would go in your business and how you could use it would be really helpful, I would think. Another application of PLM that maybe people weren't thinking about. Do you have a surprising application? Somebody's using your tools and methods in a way you didn't expect at all?
I wouldn't say surprising, because surprise is that one thing that we're trying to
avoid.
Leave out. So exactly. So if there's one thing that we're trying to avoid with process, it's that, oh, I didn't know that. Surprise.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say there are probably no real surprising applications, but there are a lot of applications that make me really proud to be part of it. If you're part of the most advanced aircrafts that are currently being produced, that's a great contribution. I'm really proud that we can help with that. Same as we're helping the whole automotive industry now to shift from combustion to electrical, plus to completely shift their business models. So especially those industries are in a huge shift, and I'm always surprised how quickly they are able to react, because they have a lot of legacy. But I'm also surprised in some cases which new players enter those markets now. And as a software engineer, of course, I'm not totally surprised that software companies try to do a lot of other things now. But I'm happy that we can help those companies understand the big industries and the industrial applications of software. So that's another aspect that I'm really excited about. And yeah, I've seen it grow over the last 20 years, and being able to help with that, that's certainly something that makes me proud and makes our company really feel a big contribution to the overall ecosystems.
Well, that's great. So unfortunately, we are all dealing with the current pandemic, and your company is located both here in the United States and in Germany, and a few other places as it grows. Tell us a little bit about your life as well as the company's life. What are the impacts or opportunities been? Have you guys seen a decrease in your business? I mean, all the car companies here in Detroit, they were furloughed for a few weeks at a time, or are you seeing other opportunities show up because people are trying to develop new drugs or things like that? How's COVID-19 affecting Method Park?
So it's interesting because we were able to shift the whole company from being in the office to working from home within actually 24 hours, and it worked without a disruption. And it's interesting because I've been working from home for 6 years now. I'm either on the road or I'm at home. So I just didn't have to change much, but the whole company, it was a huge shift for us. And we certainly see a lot of cost pressure on our customers right now. But business has been actually very good to us. And there's certainly a lot of companies that suffer a lot. But ours hasn't, because we see a lot of cost pressure, as I said, on our clients, and the need to reduce their R&D costs, the need to, but still these regulations won't go away. So we see that a lot of those companies or a lot of our clients keep their process improvement projects and their process rollouts projects still up.
Interesting.
They cut down a lot of other things, but they still keep that up and running, because the cost pressure will stay. Even if the pandemic goes away at some point, the cost pressure will stay for many years, but the product complexity won't go away. It will just go up. So what these companies or what our clients are our task to do is to do more with less, tackle more or manage more complexity with less budgets, and that only works with getting yourself more efficient, leaning out your processes, and that's right up our alley. So I'm pretty sure that we'll still see a lot of ripple effects of that we probably don't expect. But I think, the cost pressure will stay. This pressure to innovate your processes will stay. So I'm actually pretty optimistic for our future, even if costs are now the main factor right now.
Well, and I know a little bit about the compliance side of the way the stages or your product at Method Park works, but I could imagine new regulations, I guess by each country, given we seem to be solving this in a distributed fashion, where they want assurances that how you operate an airline, how you operate transportation is in fact compliant with some set of standards or regulations or safety guidelines even, right? And so I could imagine that will be businesses that maybe you aren't expecting about that'll end up using tools. And it's mostly to provide this framework for, well, this is the way we used to check that people were okay to be in a highly or a dense location where lots of other people are. And now we have to make sure that isn't the case. And so we get all this sensor data about temperatures and, how many people are per square meter. It should be one now. And how do we improve that? So it's really interesting.
Maybe an interesting discussion or an interesting point there is we just last week we started to work with a company, a very innovative company that tries to help in this pandemic that we see with a very, very innovative way of doing COVID-19 testing. And what I thought was that because everything has to be super fast, that regulations would be relaxed, and they were. So almost everything was welcomed by the regulators. That helped. And what happened is the regulators could completely overwhelmed by the application. So they got hundreds of thousands of ideas by companies that were absolutely not prepared to ever provide something like into the healthcare sector, into the medical device sector. So what happened was the FDA immediately ramped up their regulations again after they loosened it. A couple of days later, they ramped up their regulations and said, well, we need a certain maturity in those areas. So we thought that might be that governments loosen the regulations, but very quickly, after you see a couple of effects, these regulations come back to place. And it's always good to question regulations in my mind, but I think we need the right ones, and these will stay, and they will continue to innovate all the time. Well, and that definitely is fueling our business.
Yeah, and you definitely need to measure how well you're meeting the regulation. If the regulations out of context are not needed, well, that's one thing. But the public needs assurance that what's happening is safe. And gosh forbid if everything we do in our medical decisions becomes a popularity contest. It shouldn't be that. It should be scientific. And now I'll get into a discussion that'll go on for an hour, which we probably shouldn't do. But in any case, Erich, it's been a joy to chat with you. Thank you for joining us. And I think I'll pass it back to Thom.
Thanks a lot. Hey, Erich, I've got one more question for you before we let you go. And when I introduced you, I talked about how your reputation was one that, you're really known for listening to the customer. So I have a question for you, because a lot of our listeners might be growing their careers. What kind of career advice do you have for people who are maybe on that earlier stage of their career so that they can develop a stellar reputation like that?
That's a tough one. I would say definitely listen before you speak and try to understand before you try to be understood. That's for sure. But that's almost like what I would suggest is never stop to ask why. If you're tasked with something, ask yourself why, ask the others why you do that, because that leads you to a new way of thinking. think about what is the true purpose, what is that person that gives me that task trying to achieve, then I can give him a better advice, create a more innovative solution. If I really understand the motives and if I understand the background, then I can really, that's the beginning of thinking outside the box. So if I had one advice is don't stop to ask why, and try to get yourself really in the shoes of the other person, what their real true motive is, and then try to solve that problem, because that helps you really to forget that there's a box.
Erich, I'm glad I asked. That was fantastic advice. Hey, thank you so much for joining us and being part of the discussion here on this podcast. I'd like everybody who's tuned in to make sure that you join us every single week, because each time Craig and I are going to bring you more thoughts, ideas, and information in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.